perhaps am very optimistic in a lot of ways, but I do legitimately think that internalizing stories can help us deal with situations that are full of suffering and evil. Like, I think stories can strengthen us to do that in real and concrete ways.
Welcome to Ostracon, a podcast that translates fragments into the whole from which they came. I'm very happy to introduce our guest for this episode, Evyn McGraw. Evyn earned her master's degree in Theology and the Arts from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. She's currently pursuing her doctorate in English from Texas A&M. She taught for several years at various classical academies in the West, and one of the focuses of her teaching was Arthurian Legend. And I'm very privileged to talk with her today about Arthurian Legend, the classics in general, why we teach them to the young, and her experience of teaching. Evyn, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
So, Arthur.
Yeah.
Probably real.
I mean, could be.
Could be. But real probably 1,600 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, you'll correct me, but approximately 1,400 years of myth and legend layered and layered upon whatever man there was. And it's been developed by multiple cultures, passed back and forth across the channel, turned romantic, turned international. How and why do we find some kind of an essential truth at the bottom of this big mix of things?
Yeah. So, I mean, I appreciate that you're already introducing Arthuriana as this massive aggregate of all of these different ideas that have kind of coalesced into what we now think of as this mythos that does seem to have some sort of, I won't say coherent unity, but you know, there's a vibes there that definitely draws us to these stories still. So the question of like what draws us to these stories, I think is a good one. I'm going to answer kind of dialectically, and that I have two answers that I think are partially getting at something but are also insufficient. And then as I move toward those, I'm going to get toward, I think, a third answer that I hope will be a little bit more complete.
I love it.
Yeah, perfect. So, so the first answer, I think I'm just going to call a certain nostalgia. I think, you know, there's a difference between like the Middle Ages as they actually were, right? And the sort of mythic idealized Middle Ages that we see in things like fantasy and legend, right? And this mythic idealized fantasy kind of version of the Middle Ages, I think it like is what we see in the Arthurian stories. And I think there is a certain appeal to that I'm going to just call nostalgia. And what I mean by nostalgia is not like a nostalgia for a particular political or social structure, right? Like this is not, oh, we want to get back to the good old days when there were knights and castles. And I also don't quite mean like a nostalgia for anything childhood, even though that might be that might be a certain draw to Arthurian Legend, actually. So, you know, I one of the reasons that I ended up picking up Arthuriana a couple of years ago and ended up doing this lecture series about it at my school is because I wanted to read a story that made me feel like I was a kid again, right? So I picked up Roger Lancelyn Green's kind of children's stories of the Arthurian legends. And so there is a kind of there might be some sort of association with like, oh, these stories remind us of the fantasy stories we read as a kid or something like that.
Okay, but before we move on,
yeah,
I'm really interested in this idea that we could have nostalgia for things that we haven't experienced.
Yes, I'm getting there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's you're talking about like a nostalgia for a past that isn't even our own, and
Yep.
maybe a nostalgia for a culture that isn't even maybe our own.
Yeah, or yes, exactly, or never even actually really existed.
Or never
Um,
even really existed. That's a wonderful
yes.
point.
Yeah.
So then, if we share this nostalgia, then we've got to be sharing some kind of a desire. How do I want to say this? There has to be some kind of an underlying desire that we share, even if it's presents itself in this way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think we're getting at very much like the things that C.S. Lewis saw in mythology, right? This kind of immortal longing for something we don't even know how to put into words. And one of the scholars in my master's program, Judith Wolfe, she does work on phenomenology and Lewis, and she has this. It's in a podcast somewhere that she did. I think I can't remember where she said this, but she makes this interesting observation where Lewis talks about these kind of, like myths and medieval legends and things like that, embodying something about this desire for we know not what. But if that thing were to actually be instantiated, so the example that she gives, I think, is like a unicorn, right? Like there's something magical about a unicorn. But if a unicorn actually existed, the desire that is expressed in the story about the unicorn would be gone. Right. So this is something where like these myths that we're exploring, if they were actually real, they wouldn't embody the desires that we're thinking about, this nostalgia for a past that we've never experienced. So I think there is this kind of this longing for something, right?
Could that be categorized sort of as a longing for the beyond, the beyond of tangible experience? And so, I mean, maybe that takes the form of the myth, the dream, the paradise, whatever it might be.
I think so. Yeah. And so the question is like, what does that even mean? And it's it's difficult to put into words. Like, if we're talking about, I think, like desiring God or desiring heaven, or this sort of Edenic longing for something that's been lost, or for some future glory that we can't even put into words at this point. What's interesting about these myths is the way that they can kind of instantiate that in very particular but imperfect ways. So it almost like gives some sort of vision of, even a sort of like frail and faulty vision of imagining a reality that might instantiate some of that desire.
It would instantiate not just the desire, but the desired thing, the as yet unknown desired thing.
Yes, but it's tricky. I might need to think about that for a second.
Well, I'll tell you why I say that.
Okay.
I say it because, so first of all, you kind of reminded me of Augustine, that there are hungers that exist that can't be satisfied. The hunger exists because the satisfaction exists. Yeah. And so I'm wondering if part of the attraction to these Arthurian legends is this shared desire for the beyond, so, and something that we're positing is kind of beyond material experiences at hand. Well, then why is that a shared feature of our existence? And if it is, and if we turn to the past and to myth and otherwise to try and fill it, then we must in some way be looking for the thing that causes us to have the shared desire.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. The heart is restless until it rests in God.
So, all right. So let's return this to Arthur, because you see in these legends, part of the appeal of these legends, this shared longing, this nostalgia.
Yes. Yeah. Okay, this nostalgia.
And then you were going to bridge that with something else.
Oh, yeah. So I was going to talk about nostalgia, the way that I'm talking about it as a partial answer, but you already kind of latched on to the limitations of even that language, in that we're not talking about a nostalgia for a particular thing, right? We're not talking about a nostalgia for the past, and we're not talking about a nostalgia for childhood necessarily. I think this is like a big romantic thing. This is a bit of a tangent, but I think this is where my brain is going right now. Peter Kraft had a talk on YouTube at one point that I watched like 5 years ago. I think it was on the imagination. He had this interesting observation about nostalgia, specifically in the work of William Wordsworth, I believe. And he made the claim that Wordsworth longed for the inspiration of his childhood, not because there was anything in particular about his childhood that was special, but according to Kraft, there's this interesting phenomenon where we often feel nostalgic for the past because when we find ourselves, I guess, removed from sort of the vicissitudes and the cares and anxieties of that particular moment, then we're able to actually look back at those moments and see them in the actual fullness of their beauty. So we can see the meaning in the beauty of the past because we're not so stuck in the anxieties of the moment. And I think that's a really interesting observation. And I'm wondering if there's something in there with Arthurian legend as well, because the second point that I wanted to make that is also an insufficient answer, I think, is that in Arthurian legend, we have this sense of human grandeur where basically all of experience is just kind of magnified and made apparently more glorious than our everyday current experience, where we are so surrounded by anxieties and the cares of this world and things like that, right? So Arthuriana can potentially offer this escape into this vision of human grandeur that I think we also long for. So one example of this like grandeur, like the story of the Lady of Shalott. So Alfred Lord Tennyson's poem about this lady who's locked in a tower. She's cursed. She can't leave the tower or else she'll die. And she basically, because of her curse, she has to only look at the world through this mirror, and she's got to weave a tapestry of whatever she's seeing in the mirror. And along comes Lancelot, and this lady so thoroughly becomes romantically infatuated with him that she willingly leaves the mirror, looks outside, knows that she's going to die, and then leaves her tower to experience the world one last time as she is dying. So there's this willingness to leave the confines of her tower to suffer and die, but also experience the possibility of love. And when I gave a talk on the Lady of Shalott, and afterwards a fellow colleague and a friend of mine came up to me and was like, it's really interesting how this story takes like this common experience that we would now call limerence, right? Just this like psychological reality of an unhealthy romantic infatuation. And it takes that experience and dignifies it in a particular way. And for her, like for this person that I was talking to, like she found this really interesting because of the ways that these stories take all of human experience and magnifies it and shows it with this certain degree of dignity, because there's this understanding that like as human beings in all of our wide ranges of emotion, there is an incredible amount of dignity there. And so Arthuriana can, I think, get at some of that potentially.
So you said a couple of things there that maybe are worth talking about.
Yeah.
The past becomes more beautiful because it is past. It's precisely because it's no longer accessible that it allows us to see it for real, you're saying.
Yeah, I think or it's accessible in a different way, I think.
But not livable.
So let me think of an example. So I'm thinking of particular examples in my own life, like during global lockdown. I remember like I was dealing with a lot of my own stuff at that point, but now I still look back at like particular moments of my time in lockdown, of like sitting outside in the backyard in the grass underneath this big vitex plant with these big purple blossoms, and just kind of sitting in the grass and watching the sunlight coruscate through the windswept leaves and sort of create this dappled light and shade in the grass, right? And I'm feeling the heat of the sun and the cool of the grass. And like I think back on that moments like that, and I think, my goodness, I was surrounded by glory that whole time. But in the moment when I was sad and anxious about various things, I wasn't able to appreciate it just because I was stuck in my own head, if that makes sense. So I think there's a degree to which, looking back on the past, I wouldn't say we can no longer access it, because those moments still feel very real to me, but it's like the egocentric parts of those experiences are gone, if that makes sense.
You can see them a little bit through third person eyes.
I don't know. Maybe I'm being idealistic here, but maybe I'm thinking more of like a purified vision of what was really there. And that this is Kraft's interpretation. I don't know if there's any psychological or theological reality to that, but I like to think there is.
So maybe you see it more fully, or you might even venture more accurately, because the distractions of the moment have been removed from your vision.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe the same thing applies to the myth of the past, that somehow it's a concentrated or intensified sort of human experience because it's stripped of the distractions of our moment.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that summarizes things really well. Nice, yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about this idea of nostalgia, this idea of purification of vision because of the separation of time. And where does that take us next?
I mentioned this idea of human grandeur as another potential reason that we're drawn to Arthurian legend. And I think that is a partial correct reason, right? We see human experience on this grander scale, and there's something appealing about that to us. I am actually more interested, though, in the ways that Arthurian legend shows the failure of human aspirations, because I think that is actually getting at something truer and something more beautiful and more profound, which is kind of starting to again gesture towards sort of the third thing that I'm going to want to be talking about. So I want to give an example of one of the Arthurian stories that describes the process of human failure and how we actually see meaning in it. So I'm going to talk about the story of Sir Percival. So Sir Percival, he starts out as a young man living in the woods with his mother. So his mother has purposefully run away into the woods with him to try and keep him from entering the world of chivalry and the world of knighthood. She doesn't want him to be part of that world. However, he's just a natural hunter, right? And he has almost like this natural quality of knighthood. He ends up coming across some knights, and he's so taken with their knightly appearance that he's like, well, I have to join that world. I have to be part of that world. So his mother is distraught, but she makes him this ridiculous leather armor and puts him on an old nag and sends him out into the world. And he has some, a bunch of misadventures as he's entering the world of knighthood. A lot of his story then is about learning how to participate in chivalric society. He has to learn sort of the rules of being a nobleman and a warrior and things like that. So he ends up, he's a really good fighter. He just needs to learn sort of the cultural norms, right? He ends up running into this older knight who kind of helps guide him in things. And one of the things that this knight tells him is, okay, you have to stop talking about your mother and you have to stop asking stupid questions. So don't ask any unnecessary questions, because that is, that's just part of what you do as a knight. I guess it's like you don't want to look foolish, right? Now, this gets Percival into trouble because on one of his adventures, he ends up coming across the enchanted castle of the Fisher King, who is the guardian of the Holy Grail, right? Which, of course, is this magical item very much associated with the Eucharist. It's supposed to be the cup that caught Jesus's blood at the crucifixion. So Percival goes to the Fisher King's castle, and he joins them for dinner. He joins them for a feast. And what progresses is essentially this almost like a mass procession as these figures bring the chalice, the grail, into the hall, and they walk the chalice through the hall, and they don't say anything about it. And Percival is like, what in the world is going on? But he thinks of his, mentor's basically commands to like not ask any questions, because that is the mores of his noble society. He can't breach those, right? So he's got to live according to the manners of what it means to be a knight. When he does not ask the question about what this thing actually is, he ends up getting cursed because of that. So he goes to bed, he wakes up to discover that everyone in the castle has vanished, and he understands that something horrible has gone wrong. And he ends up like coming across, in the Chrétien de Troyes version of this story, he ends up coming across, I believe, his cousin, who tells him that because you just left home and were very careless, your mom died of grief. So there's this understanding that like not only has Percival failed in this supernatural quest in some way, he's also the cause of his mother's death. And the way of interpreting this story, I think, is really interesting, because like there's a way of reading Arthurian legend about like, oh, these beautiful ideals of human valor and things like that, right? Like the Knights of the Round Table, what a glorious idea. But this story is so interesting because it is precisely Percival's adherence to this knightly ideal that makes him unwilling or unaware of the reality of supernatural grace, right? So that's kind of the allegorical way of reading this story. There's other potential interpretations of what's going on here. So in Wolfram von Eschenbach, the German writer who kind of retold this story, in his version, the question that Percival fails to ask isn't, what is this thing? The question that Percival fails to ask is instead about the Fisher King himself. So the Fisher King is suffering this incurable wound because of another knight. There's like, a whole narrative about this other knight that ends up stabbing the Fisher King with the lance of Longinus and things like that, and then enabling the arrival of the Holy Grail, which is a whole other interesting thing. The fact that we need this supernatural wounding for the arrival of supernatural grace. But anyway, yeah, so the Fisher King is suffering this incurable wound. And in Eschenbach's version, the question that Percival fails to ask is, what are you going through, right? Like, what is the nature of your suffering? And Simone Weil has an essay where she rephrases it as, what are you going through, right? So it's interesting here in that Percival's adherence to an ideal, his belief in the grandeur of knightly society, actually makes him fail to love, and specifically fail to love in a Christ-like way, right? Like fail to see someone in their suffering and be like, what are you going through? And I think that the fact that we have the Fisher King suffering and presiding over the Holy Grail is so interesting, because we're tying together the nature of suffering and love. So Percival ends up failing because of that. Now, Eschenbach's version is really interesting, because then Percival has to undergo this almost like penitential time in his quest. So the analogies that Eschenbach uses to describe Percival are really interesting, because he starts associating Percival with wintertime. He's like, he has to wander the these wintertime ways, whereas Arthur himself is associated with springtime. He's the Mayful man. So Percival has to experience desolation. He has to experience suffering, and he has to be aware of his own failure. After he does that for an extended period of time, then he is able to go back to the Fisher King and ask him about the nature of his suffering. And I think that's so fascinating, because it seems like he is able to ask that question because he himself has finally suffered. Like he understands the nature of suffering, and therefore he is able to love someone else in their suffering. So when we're thinking about human grandeur, what's interesting to me in these stories is the fact that ultimately everyone fails. Percival is just a microcosm of everyone else, right? Camelot falls for various reasons. Depending on the retelling, there's different reasons that Camelot ends up falling.
The biggest, it might be worth just saying one of the most well-known reasons from the Mallory versions is that Lancelot, the best knight of the Round Table, has a long-running affair with Guinevere, the wife of
Yes.
Arthur,
Yeah.
and the results of that end up leading to a conflict that decimates the kingdom, and they can no longer
Yes.
defend their land. So, I mean, failure, as you say, on a grand scale.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it's like individual personal failure. So Lancelot and Guinevere.
Well, individual personal failure that has communal consequences.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 And actually, it's not even really individual. And so Arthur, okay, romances in general are interesting in the way that there are different kind of archetypes that end up being kind of echoed throughout particular narratives. So you'll see repeated plot points show up over and over and over again. And for in Arthuriana, like you have a lot of those moments of, direct intentional infidelity, like Arthur's father, right? Like Arthur's father, what happens with Uther trying to get Merlin's help to disguise him as, I think, Gerlois, and go be unfaithful with the Lady Igraine to birth Arthur. There's resonances with that, with Lancelot and Guinevere's infidelity, with the birth of Galahad, with Lancelot and Elaine. So there's these resonances of the individual personal failing that does also seem to be some sort of communal and cosmic failing.
Yeah. So, I mean, it feels to me like these points about grandeur, both in grand deeds, grand failures, sometimes, grand transformations, that it is of a piece and also at odds with what we started out before talking about shared nostalgia. Because on the one hand, where the grandeur is that of failure, and maybe failure that is even grander, so to speak, because they strove so greatly in the first place. But I mean, that in itself doesn't feel nostalgic, because it's hard to imagine nostalgia for loss or failure.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, if the stories are proving out a transformation of heart, a realization of truth, then maybe it does align with what we were saying. Because when we were envisioning nostalgia as a purified vision separated from the distractions of the time, well, then maybe it's possible to see the transformation that really occurred once you can separate yourself from the pain of being transformed.
Oh, interesting. Can you explain what you mean by that? I think I know where you're going with that, but I want to make sure that I understand.
Well, I'm saying maybe it's a way that you can bring together your point about nostalgia and your point about grandeur. Because even if the grandeur is a grandness of failure and transformation, perhaps a thing about which it might be hard to be nostalgic for because it's painful. If the nostalgia is the type of nostalgia that allows you to see things more truly because you're separated from the pain of going through them, then maybe the view to the transformation is clearer, as opposed to just seeing the pain of transforming.
Oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. Well, I think you're better able to see how the pain of transformation can be brought together with beauty. So I think I remember when I watched The Green Knight, David Lowery's version of, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the film version. I remember how the last scene, it played out differently than than it did in the Middle English poem, in that there was interesting resonances to, like the sacrament of confession, really, unlike what happens in the Middle English poem. So in the Green Knight, in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, just the kind of a rundown of the plot of the Middle English poem. The knights are all feasting at Christmas time in King Arthur's court. In walks this giant green kind of, figure associated with nature. This is this mysterious green knight. He's all green. He's on a big green horse. The way he's described is very much like, almost like this Santa Claus type figure. He's got a giant axe, and he challenges the knights to what he calls, or to a game. Basically, the game is that they're going to exchange blows. So one of the knights is going to, take a swing at the Green Knight, and then a year later, the Green Knight will meet with this knight in the Green Chapel, a far distance away, and the Green Knight will give the same blow to whatever knight will rise to this challenge. Now, so Sir Gawain is the one who rises to this challenge. He beheads the Green Knight. And instead of dying, the Green Knight picks up his head and is like, all right, I'll see you a year from now. And so Gawain knows that he has a year left to live. And he's got to spend basically this next year preparing for this journey to the Green Chapel and what he thinks is going to be his own death.
Assuming, of course, that he actually goes.
Yes.
Because the story almost presumes that it's not an option for him to not keep the deal.
Yes, yeah. And I think David Lowery plays that up in his movie, especially because in that version, Gawain is very clearly unwilling. I think in the Middle English poem, it's a little more ambiguous. He seems to be a gallant knight who's willingly going on this quest, even though he starts getting afraid later on. So Gawain goes on this quest. He's journeying toward the Green Chapel. He ends up in the house of Lord Bertilac and his wife, where there's basically the middle part of the poem turns into kind of like this mini contest where Bertilac invites Gawain to stay there until it's time for him to go to the Green Chapel. So he stays there for 3 days, and they agree to this game where Bertilac's going to go out hunting, and he'll bring back his winnings for Gawain. In turn, Gawain needs to give Bertilac whatever his winnings end up being. And of course, basically the situation is that Gawain is seduced by Bertilac's wife every morning of the 3 days. So on the first day, she kisses him, and at the end of the day, when they're exchanging their earnings, and Bertilac is like, I brought you an animal that we're going to feast on, Gawain does share the kiss with Lord Bertilac. Second day, 2 kisses. Again, he shares it with Lord Bertilac. On the third day, though, the wife gives Gawain this, what she claims is going to be a talisman to protect him. It's this green girdle that she's like, this will keep you safe from death. So Gawain takes it, and in the Middle English poem, he's afraid for his life, right? He takes it because he's afraid for his life, and he doesn't share it with Lord Bertilac. So when he finally goes to the Green Chapel, he's standing before the giant green man with the axe. He's terrified. The Green Knight swings the axe once, doesn't hit him, twice, doesn't hit him. He swings a third time, barely nicks him, and he says, that nick was for your failure to tell me that you took the girdle, because of course the green man is actually Lord Bertilac, right? And he was testing Gawain's honesty and chivalry in his dealings with Bertilac's wife, right? In David Lowery's movie, this plays out differently, like very differently. So first of all, Gawain ends up running away. He's at the chapel, and he's like, I can't do this. I'm too afraid to die. I'm out, right? And what progresses is this long montage of him going back to Camelot, being praised as the knight who fulfilled this quest, getting everything he ever wanted in life. He ends up becoming king. He gets all of the honor and glory he desired. And all the while, as this montage is going, you see the green girdle around his waist, and it's the only green in the shot, and it seems to be this thing that's just haunting him this entire time, right? He gets everything he ever wanted, he gets honor, and he realizes that he is absolutely miserable because of it, because the honor that he gets is not actually what he wanted. And so this montage ends after his beheading. So there's this weird surreal moment where they're a warring kingdom breaking down the gates of Camelot, and they're about to barge in and destroy everything, Suddenly his head just rolls from his shoulders. It's a weird, surreal moment. But he then just wakes up. He's outside the chapel again. This whole montage has been a vision of the life that he could have. And so then he goes into the chapel and he stands before the Green Knight and he removes the girdle from his waist. And he's like, okay, I'm ready for this. And I think what struck me so much when I saw that movie was the fact that it seems to play out like some sort of sacramental confession, right? Like he's kneeling before the Green Knight. He brings his own, shortcomings out into the light of truth. And he's like, all right, I'm bringing forth what is really going on inside into the light of truth. And then the Green Knight, leans down, smiles at him, joyfully says, off with his head. And it's very ambiguous whether or not Gawain ends up dying because of that. It could all have just been a game, right? So I think like when we're thinking about transformation, I think what struck me in thinking about like my own shortcomings and my own desire for transformation is like there was this real, I don't know, this identification, I guess, with this moment, in specifically in like a sacramental context, but being like, okay, I know what that transformation, like I know the pain of that, but then I'm also seeing the beauty of it too. So I think to your point about being able to see the transformation but divorced from the pain of it in our own lives, I don't know if it's necessarily like we're separated from the pain of it. I think we also, though, are better able to see the grace in it, I think would be my thought.
Well, you're giving some compelling reasons to read these stories. And you're giving some very interesting interpretations of what, at first blush sounds like a standard medieval knight's tale, but within it hides all of these deeper interpretations. And I mean, that is one of the things that perpetually seems to call us back to these stories. Before we advance to the next stage of this analysis, I want to test you a little bit.
Okay.
You were just talking about Gawain and the Green Knight and people's heads getting cut off. That's all over these stories. I mean, the violence
so
is
much.
rampant.
Yes.
How do you understand that in line with the interpretations you're offering?
Well, I think it's a fun question. One thing, particularly in Mallory, I think is how, and this is not an academic answer at all. This is just kind of based on vibes, but it does often feel like Mallory is writing, the way that he writes the Arthurian legends is very much like a 12-year-old boy slamming together a bunch of action figures, who's very eager to just kind of get to the next thing and get to the next fight scene. And I do think they're like, I don't know. So for me, it's very difficult to actually like take the violence seriously. But that is another thing to be like, okay, yeah, again, when we're talking about nostalgia for these stories, we are not talking about a literal instantiation of a bunch of knights who are brutally slaughtering each other as they're going on quests out in the forest somewhere. So, one thing is to just kind of not take the violence seriously and be like, well, it's very non-literal, and just, think of it as this kind of adventure story. So that would be, that's one thought on violence. But I think like violence in literature, of course, my mind is going to go to Flannery O'Connor, because we've been talking a lot about grace, right? The grace that we see in these stories from the human frailty specifically. There's an interesting aesthetic that the Arthurian stories have in kind of Christian, like the Christian literary imagination. There are several different understandings of how you can understand like literature as yielding spiritual meaning. There's one thing called like, the analogical imagination, right? In that the what we see happening in these stories somehow reflects some in a limited analogy reflects something about the nature of God, right? So in Arthurian legend, we can think of really kind of potentially obvious examples of, okay, King Arthur, he is this glorious king who is on some level supernatural, right? Some sort of analogy to Christ as king, the head of this community of glorious warriors, who is bringing the world into an era of flourishing. So there's some sort of limited analogy potentially to Christ, and I think so.
I mean, limited in the sense that Arthur is full of his own failings.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's almost like in the good that he strives to achieve, and to some degree does achieve in spite of his failings, that it maybe is a glimpse of what could be hoped for in a real and final way.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So the analogical imagination, I think, is the alternative, or not the alternative, but the pair with that is the dialectical imagination, which is precisely what you're talking about, where there is this radical break in the analogy that points us beyond the thing itself and to some sort of future reality, some sort of transcendent spiritual meaning that we're actually like longing for, right? So limited analogy in King Arthur to Christ. Arthur fails, and then there's the radical break that shows us that there has to be, like, it shows us the need for grace, right? Like, it shows us our own failings and our own, basically a need for a savior. And so with the violence stuff, I'm wondering if there's something in that, where like we have this sort of analogy, we have the analogical imagination in these knights who are going out and fulfilling these quests and saving people and bringing some sort of flourishing to the land. But then there's also this incredible violence and this incredible callousness that they portray, that then maybe is the sort of dialectical break. And The Once and Future King by T.H. White is really plays up the problems with violence in Arthuriana, because I mentioned that different Arthurian retellings will basically essentially describe the fundamental flaw of Arthurian, like the Arthurian society, in a different way. And White really emphasizes human beings' propensity toward violence. So he, is writing very much in response to World War II. He actually compares Arthur to Hitler at one point. And yeah, his thing is like, he has Lancelot and Guinevere, that's a thing, but it almost feels like that ends up being, in this roundabout way, just kind of caught up in the human propensity towards violence, which is actually what causes the kingdom to fall. So yeah, like, what do you do with the violence in the stories? I think so there's the dismissive posture that we can take, where we're just like, okay, well, it's just a children's story. It's just a 12-year-old boy crashing action figures together. Or we can do the dialectical thing, where we're seeing the radical break in whatever limited analogy of grace that we're seeing here, which is actually making us aware of our need for a savior, which I think is more kind of the way that O'Connor uses violence and grace in her stories, although she's doing a little bit of a different thing. So maybe my immediate reaction of being like, I want to talk about O'Connor doesn't quite work here. But
do you think that the stories have to be imperfect in order to be internalizable? I mean, if you had these stories that were just about grandeur without flaw or failure,
mm-hmm.
I question whether they would survive in the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost as though to see anything of yourself in them and to actualize any of these things that we've been talking about here, you have to see the part of the character that transcends their failures. And then it has meaning because they've actually stepped out of their limitations into something greater.
Can you explain that last bit? Like, stepped out of their limitations into something greater.
What I mean is that maybe there's no gap to bridge when the character does just exactly what you would expect them to do.
Yeah.
But when they are weak and then they overcome that weakness to do something that is truly noble, then it's relatable because we all know our own flaws and our own hopes. So that the doing of the good, the doing of the noble thing, on the one hand, is transformative and offers that sense of nostalgia, and on the other hand, demonstrates that even the noblest of deeds are in some way fleeting, leading us back, as you say, to the desire for some more ultimate fulfillment.
Yeah. I like the way that you put it about the failure making it internalizable. I think there's something in Arthurian legend that I've described as a sort of existential woundedness that I think gets at what we actually are in a particular way. In that, like, we want these ideals, we want the good, we want a flourishing society, we want to be noble, but we fail over and over and over and over again so consistently. And we long for the infinite, right? We long for infinite love. Getting back to our earlier discussion, the heart is restless until it rests in God. And yet we don't know how to get there on our own, right? Like we're just doing the best we can. And so I think these stories are so fascinating because you have these characters who, when they fail, like they reach the end of themselves, and that is where some sort of grace is able to meet them. And so I think what ends up like bridging the gap that you're talking about is, I think the awareness of our own weakness is good and beautiful, because it is when we are aware of our own weakness and our own failings and just our own finitude, how frail we are, and yet we long for the infinite. It's in those moments when we are able, I think when we are most fully open to God ultimately. I think that's when that he can reach us most fully and bring us into this reality of love that is greater than ourselves.
And so the strivings and the failings that we see in myth, they're kind of like a marriage of this innate desire to strive, and also a reminder that the fulfillment of that striving is beyond ourselves, which is a reminder sort of what's behind the striving in the first place.
I like that.
So speaking of striving and speaking of grand acts, I pulled out a couple of my own parts of the legends. These are all from Mallory, that I thought exhibited this kind of grandness, and I wanted your reaction to them. One of them, so you mentioned Lancelot having an affair with Elaine, and then Galahad, the knight Galahad, is born from that affair. There's one point where Lancelot ends up sleeping with Elaine because Elaine has gone to a magician, for lack of a better term, to make her look like Guinevere. And so Lancelot thinks that he's with his love, Guinevere, who's actually Arthur's wife, but it turns out it's Elaine. And in the morning, he finds out what has happened. And he says, "Alas, that I have lived so long. Now I am shamed." It's kind of a tremendous statement to say, "Alas, that I have lived so long, that it would have been better for me to have died and not done what I did." That's an almost inaccessible emotion, it feels like, to a contemporary mind. That you
mean just like the intensity of it?
No, it's the unattachment of it. I mean, I feel, at least in myself and in the world around me, in my own experience, a great attachment to life, and a great attachment to this idea that you can always be remade. This feeling that it would be better to die than to do this thing requires an unattachedness to life, preferring living well over living at all. It's a grand statement.
Yeah.
I'll give you another one.
Yeah. Well, that's so interesting too, because I mean, I think it's spoken in an excess of emotion, so I think there could be a hyperbole there. However, that statement is also so interesting if this act is what brings about Galahad, who ends up achieving the Holy Grail as well. So it's like this, I wish I had never been born. I've done such a terrible thing. And yet that's what had to happen for Galahad to be born. So I don't know what to do with that. There's some sort of Felix culpa thing going on there, I think. I don't.
You know what? That's a really interesting point. I mean, maybe on the one hand, if you isolate the statement, it seems like he's unattached to his life in preference of virtue. But maybe that's a misinterpretation because the statement is isolated. If it's the result of that you have Galahad, who, as you say, is the one who ultimately achieves the Grail in the Grail quest, then maybe the point really is that Lancelot is wrong. Maybe he could regret what he did, but he can't lament his life because things are being brought out of him greater than he can understand.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that.
Lancelot later on gets to see the Grail. I think he never gets to touch it, but I think at one point he gets to see it. Do I have that right?
It's been a minute since I've read this bit of Mallory. I believe he's chasing the Grail a lot. There are multiple instances, I think, where he is in the general vicinity of it, and he's basically just frozen to the spot. Like he can't move.
Yeah.
And then it vanishes from the premises.
Yeah. Yeah, and he delivers this line: "Fair sweet Father Jesus Christ, if ever I did a thing that pleased thee, Lord, for thy pity, ne have me not in despite for my sins done before time, that thou show me something of that I seek." In other words, if I ever did anything good, please don't leave me in my sins, but show me something that I seek.
Yeah.
Another grand statement of desire, a desire that leads him maybe to honesty of self.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's like an awareness of his own wretchedness, where he is just longing for this perfection that's beyond him. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we see these two things interwoven: his longing and his failure.
Mm-hmm.
Another one that sticks out to me is a time when he comes to visit Guinevere when she's staying in a castle, and there are other knights guarding her bedroom, so he can't come to see her in the middle of the night. But he comes in through the window, and to get through the window, he has to pull the bars out of the window. And he says this line, "I shall prove my might for your love." And then he pulls the bars out of the stone. He rips his hands all up while he does it. So he bleeds all over the sheets while he's there. And in the morning, when they find her with these bloody sheets, they think that she has had an affair with one of the knights who is wounded. She denies it, and Lancelot ends up going to fight for her in a trial by battle to prove that she didn't have an affair with this other wounded knight, even though it was him all along. To me, there's something in the removal of the bars and the blood.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a passion that is violent, right? Like it's literally a violent passion, which again I think is I guess getting back to that idea of human experience at this just grand and intense scale, I suppose.
Yeah, but it's also a wound.
Yeah.
And
I see. Yeah.
And there's a double wound, because his passion is wrong because Guinevere is Arthur's wife, but he's wounded by it and he bleeds for it anyway.
Yeah.
And then,
I like that. Yeah.
Right, and this is sort of coupled to another wound, in the sense that the charge of adultery wrongly falls on this other knight who's just been wounded in battle, has nothing to do with this at all.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And then there's a different kind of wound in that Arthur would suffer to have his queen fought over, and if the wrong person won the battle, she would be burned at the stake.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's wounding himself as he's doing this. I like that.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, obviously they knew they were going to get caught because the bed sheets were covered in blood, but there was no turning back.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is, this is the same character that says, if ever I've done anything good, then keep me not in my sins, but show me something of that which I seek.
Yeah, it feels very much like Augustine's "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." The sort of willingness to continue in the vice, even though you know it's hurting you, and you know it's not good, and you know God doesn't want you to do it, and yet you're still continuing. They're still continuing in the affair, and
Yeah.
it's causing real repercussions for everyone else. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Though they seem to be trying to grasp the eternal in it.
Yeah.
Even misdirectedly. Here's another thing I wanted to ask you. Your definition or your description of the story of the Lady of Shalott sounds a lot like the cave, doesn't it?
Oh, Plato's cave?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one interpretation for sure of okay, there's a lot about the Lady of Shalott that's about kind of the role of art and a sort of distanced contemplation versus like experience of the world. So potential like Plato's cave reading is okay, yeah, she's in the tower, she's looking at the world through the mirror, she's not seeing the world as it actually is. Then when she falls in love with Lancelot and leaves the tower, then she is actually experiencing reality as it actually is. And so there's kind of the connections there between, Plato's negative view of art as it being at a remove from reality, right? Because for him, the forms are the real. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely an analogy that could be drawn to the cave, which in that case is interesting in that the real is where suffering and love can happen versus the distanced, safe contemplation that happens in the tower.
That's a great point. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was a completely different view of nostalgia and how you think it might relate to or differ from what we're discussing. I once heard it said that the past is a prison of nostalgia because nostalgia traps you in what has already happened as opposed to in the now. Whereas the future, I've heard it said, is a prison of anxiety because everything is wondering what will be, what will happen, and that all of the action of life is in the present. That nostalgia could be in some way an ingratitude for the opportunities that are in the now because you're sort of trapped in the past. What do you think of that vis-a-vis the legends?
Yeah. No, I think, okay, it reminds me of the beginning of Dante's Purgatory, where Dante is about to start ascending Mount Purgatory, but he gets distracted because he meets the poet Casella, and they start singing, and they're just having a good time, and they're reminiscing about their, pasts as poets. And Virgil comes along, and he's like, Dante, you have to go up the mountain. We have to go on this journey. Stop it. And so, yeah, I think there is this idea of nostalgia as the thing that actually kind of like stultifies your progress in life. It's like you're so busy thinking about some sort of beauty that was lost or something like that you aren't able to, either experience the beauty here and now or just move forward toward, move forward in life. I think I'm almost wondering if my term nostalgia is just the wrong term. I think the reason that I mentioned that I call it nostalgia is because it very much has that experiential quality, a phenomenological reality, I guess, of nostalgia. But, like what we mentioned, like what I mentioned, it's not nostalgia for something in particular, right? Like it's not nostalgia either for this political past or for your own personal past. So I think that, that's one answer, is that the nostalgia of the legends is something else. But also, I don't think nostalgia for your past is inherently a negative thing, because I think moments of like recollection where you're able to kind of see and vicariously re-experience the beauty of your own past can actually be an opportunity for gratitude. To be like, I exist in this world and I've had these experiences. What a beautiful and wonderful reality that is. And I think that can actually fuel you as you are moving forward in life. So, nostalgia can be a prison, but I think it can also, yeah, it can also be, like what I said, an opportunity for gratitude and fuel for moving forward.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a difference between being grateful for your past, or being grateful maybe from the things you've learned from your past, and wishing that you could relive it.
Mm-hmm.
Those would be two different things. And as you say, the longing that we have for the transcendent in these stories is not a longing to actually be there and to live them. It's this longing for the beyond that
Yeah.
that we may find in them. So the ideal would be that you're not getting stuck in the story. You're not getting trapped in the story. You're taking from the story something that tells you about the now, if you're reading it right.
Yeah, well, there's this interesting thing because I think there is a certain escapism that needs to happen in the story. So whatever it tells you about the now is in this like different, I don't know, is in an indirect mode, if that makes sense. I don't know.
You go to have you have the experience of this inaccessible past. You internalize it, and then it gives you something usable in the present.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that works.
I mean, your term escapism is kind of what triggered for me the idea of maybe a reader who really wishes they could be in this other time.
Yeah.
But what's funny about that is, as you pointed out at the beginning of this conversation, it's not a time that ever really existed.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, even if Arthur were real, as I understand it, he was probably living in a power vacuum created by the collapse of Rome and the withdrawal from the British Isles, and held out for a generation against other invading forces.
Yeah. Yeah. Petty warlord in an Iron Age hill fort or something like that.
It's one way. I mean, you could break it down that way.
Yeah.
I mean, nobody knows for sure, but it emphasizes the point that these legends, even though they're set in the past, they aren't a past that was ever real.
Yeah, okay. I feel like there are two things. There's the issue of escapism. Then there's also the issue of a literalization of Arthuriana, and I'll explain what I feel like I'm vaguely meaning by that here in a second. But I think the issue of escapism I'm actually less concerned about, because I think, like Tolkien makes this point in on fairy stories where he's like, the only people who care about escapism are literary critics and jailers. And he makes the point that like actually it is good to want to escape from a fallen reality, right? Like, his understanding is that myths and fairy tales can again point us toward a reality that is more beautiful and potentially truer than what we're experiencing now.
Well,
As far
hold
as
on. I want to push back on that though.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, fiction conveys truth, but I'm not sure that a fiction could ever be realer than what is real.
Well, these are kind of Platonic assumptions. No, so I think, yeah. Well, it's like an interesting kind of. I think his point is that actually, I'm discovering some of my own, I guess, philosophical presuppositions. I think the love of God is realer than the evil of this life. And insofar as literature can potentially point us toward something of the love of God, then we can see past the things in this world that will ultimately be untrue.
You can see the transcendent from the material.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. No, no, I get the point. I mean, I get the point. I mean, that's one of the philosophies of this podcast is that we can
Yeah.
find, that we can find the transcendent and we can know it and we can come closer to it and that yeah, it is transcendent because it's beyond the material. But then you have to live in the world. I mean,
Yes.
you have to
Yes.
come in and be the light and the salt in the world.
Yeah.
So there's a task. I mean, when you come down from the mountain, there's a task at hand.
Yes. No, that's a great point. Yeah. So you don't want to just escape into the fiction. There is also then like you see the grace in it, and then you discover kind of the concrete demands of love. And, I think, I don't know,
Yeah, you discover the concrete demands of love. That's well said.
no, thank you. Yeah, okay, so in that sense, then I could see a problem with with escapism for sure. So I think it depends on, I guess there is something kind of egocentric about that kind of escapism, where you're just like, I want the experience of this beauty, but then I'm not going to let it transform me and then go back into the world and try to pass it on or something like that, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, yeah, I could see that being,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, but as we discuss it, I think we may be underscoring our earlier point that you can't be trapped in a place other than what is your own.
Hmm.
But the things that we take from this place of myth and legend, at least in these stories, is the transformative moments of the characters despite their suffering and weakness. So the very thing about the stories that calls us into them and thereby calls us into beyond, it is in some sense a model for then doing that ourselves, for then transforming ourselves or being transformative ourselves. So I mean, if you read these stories the right way, the call into the past is a call into a similar transformative work in the present.
Yeah, for sure, yeah. Perhaps I'm very optimistic in a lot of ways, but I do legitimately think that internalizing stories can help us deal with situations that are full of suffering and evil. Like, I think stories can strengthen us to do that in real and concrete ways. So I think, ultimately the test of like, is this a good escapism or a bad escapism is how does it affect the way that you live, and are you able to like suffer better because of it? Like, are you able to love people to selflessly because of something of the grace that you've seen in these stories?
So we have great deeds and great failures. That was your second point.
Yeah.
And you thought you were going to bring this together somehow.
I don't know. Yeah, I think, how was I going to bring it together?
You had a third
Yeah,
point.
I did. I mean, it's the sort of thing that I almost feel like is left best unsaid, because I think that to describe it is to kind of render it abstract, which is what we don't need in these stories. But I think it ultimately is our frailty and our need for grace, right? Our ultimately like our desire for God. And so that was kind of the point of, thinking about nostalgia. Okay, it's not nostalgia, but what is the desire for, right? There's something about the human failure in these stories that shows us getting to the end of ourselves, and yet in that failure being open to something beyond us. So, I think there is a way of reading grace in these stories, and I think like ultimately that's what I see in them. Yeah, in that they present this beautiful ideal which will fail, but even in the failing there is beauty, because that's when we're aware of our, I guess, of our need for grace. And even the awareness of grace can be the means by which we receive it.
Well, I mean, that takes me back to something that we hinted at the beginning when we were trying to get to this shared experience of the desire for the beyond. That we kind of drink in
Yeah.
myths like this. Maybe the proposal that they demonstrate that grace is real, that grace is needed, and that grace might be attained. I mean, maybe that is the beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's grace in. I keep going back to like the idea of woundedness. I think of the Fisher King having to undergo the wound for the arrival of the Holy Grail. I think of the fact that Arthur ends up getting wounded and having to go to the Isle of Avalon. And so there's something about like the wounded king, right, in these stories. So yes, I think like the need and the reception and the desire for grace is the beyond, but very specifically, like there's something incarnational going on here in the grace that we receive through, I don't know, this awareness of suffering and like the reality of our own woundedness because of sin, and also Christ's woundedness for us out of love, and the way that our own woundedness can be transformed into that love.
Yeah, and I mean, much like the story of the fall itself, it's a story that can't be told without great striving and great failure.
Yeah.
And so we started out by saying, why read these stories, given their age, given the patchwork? I mean, we've identified a number of different authors over the course of this discussion who were writing or rewriting different versions of these stories over centuries in different places, in France, in England. You even talked about, 20th century film, all of these different versions that together make up Arthuriana. Why read them? And I think that leads us to our next topic, which is why teach them? Especially,
Yeah.
Why teach these stories? Or why teach other stories like them or other myths to the young? Why do we do it?
Yeah, okay. Well, so I'm going to talk about specifically why I did stuff with these stories, and then I think I'll kind of meander my way into an answer. Because I didn't specifically teach these in general in the classroom setting. I did do the Green Knight in a medieval literature class I did at a previous school, but at the last school that I was at, I just started reading these stories for fun and writing about them. And I was like, hey, I could do something with this. I could turn these into some sort of public-facing lecture where, students and parents and everyone would be invited. And it would just be a way of like giving back to the community. And honestly, my reason for doing that was pretty simple. It was just because I loved what I was reading and I saw beauty and truth in them. So Joseph Pieper, 20th century Catholic philosopher, has a way of describing love. And he says that love is this existential affirmation that says, it's good that you exist. I'm glad that you are here. And that is the reason that I do a lot of my teaching, is simply because I love these stories. I think they're so beautiful, and it is just an honor to be able to talk about them and to share my love for them with other people. So that is one individual reason for why I see these stories as worthwhile, is just because I individually do. But I think that individual sense of like there is beauty and goodness and truth here that is worth sharing is another reason why one would want to teach these, right? When it comes to teaching stuff to the young, I find myself in interesting situation where I've been in very different teaching contexts. So I've been in, the classical education context where we do want to talk about educating for virtue and things like that, right? And so, there was one answer that could be like, what sort of virtues do you see here? Although to me, as we've discussed, to me, what is most interesting in these stories is not the Aristotelian virtues. It's honestly more of a theological virtue of understanding our own humility, I guess, right? Like our own finitude, our own frailty, and yet our desire for the infinite, and our desire for like ultimately the love of God. So I think there's just like a truth quality to the stories that I would talk about. in more of a classical education context, right? Now, I also teach in a secular context where, this idea of like educating for virtue, or being like, I am going to tell these stories to you because I think that they are true. That's not really the posture that we're supposed to have. But even in those contexts, I think there's still that, students still hopefully, I think, come with some sort of desire for something that's interesting and meaningful and worthwhile, right? And so even if, the sort of Christian vision of the universe that we're seeing in the Arthurian stories is not one that the students share, there is still, I think, an appeal to myth, in that there's this meaningful system of ideas. There's this meaningful vision of the cosmos that is just beautiful and worth discussing. So, ultimately, like, I think my original answer of just like, I teach these because I love them, kind of works in both contexts. So, it depends on what kind of style of education you are inhabiting, as far as why you might want to teach it. But, I think it's worthwhile to teach in across contexts.
It seems to me like kids love myths.
Yeah.
Of all different times and places. Do you think that these stories are myths?
How are you defining myths?
Well, I guess they're not the acts of quote unquote divine beings like you might have in certain series of myths, but they are certainly about characters interacting immediately with the divine in an inaccessible and hyperbolic past.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of, so the ways of defining myth, like, this very much depends on just how we're defining the term, because there's ways of defining myth where it's like, a narrative that seeks to make some sense of the cosmos in describing where we've come from, like what we are for, how human beings situate themselves in the cosmos, and where we're going. And then, as you mentioned, there's the kind of the direct divine intervention, the interaction with gods or supernatural beings. Myth is kind of like this all-encompassing cosmic tale about human destiny, I think. Maybe, I don't know. Would that be a working definition?
I mean, what you say is very interesting, because no, they're not a cosmic story about how we got here.
Yeah.
But when it comes to how we situate ourselves in the cosmos and where we're going, then definitely.
Yeah.
Do you think that students like these stories for the same reasons that they like myths? Do you ever teach mythology?
Kind of. So I taught the Iliad. Yeah, I mean, I think there are similarities between Arthurian stuff and the Iliad, right? You don't have necessarily some sort of description of cosmic origins in the Iliad specifically. It's just about the Trojan War. But then there's also the idea of Achilles kind of railing against the universe as he's coming to terms with the nature of mortality, which there are some similarities, I think, going on in Arthurian legend. So insofar as so maybe not a myth, maybe an epic, if we're gonna think about kind of our taxonomy here, I suppose.
Yeah, that's a good point. But I guess anytime you have characters up against the realities of being, and what it means to be good, and what it means to lay your life down for something, what it means to make a sacrifice, then you're in the space of art that situates us in some kind of a great drama beyond ourselves. But then, as I'm describing this, I'm thinking art doesn't have to be the Iliad or Arthuriana, or to have any of the trappings of those grandiose doings in order to do that. I mean, sometimes the subtlest stories about the most mundane things encounter us with that cosmic struggle and with our identity amid dramatic forces. So, I mean, if you're going to call Arthuriana a myth for that reason, then it's almost like all great literature is a myth.
Yeah, true. Yeah, yeah,
which kind of would destroy the category.
yeah.
But having this conversation serves the purpose of identifying maybe what it is that makes these worthwhile to spend our time with. Tell me something else. What was your favorite thing about being a teacher?
Oh man. I I think it so being a teacher, I will say, is really difficult. It's, um, especially a high school teacher. I think, teaching college is way easier in a lot of ways. But it's so beautiful. I think a couple of things that I would say is, first of all, what I said of just like the privilege of being able to talk about the things that I love for a living and share those things and get hopefully like decently good at being able to articulate why something is beautiful and why something is worth knowing, or just worth thinking about. So the privilege of being able to just engage with the subject matter is one thing, but then also just like the joy of, I mean, just the joy of interacting with students, in all of their individuality and quirks and interests and things like that. But there's also, the moments when students either, it doesn't have to be, I'm having a debate with myself in my head, because there are moments when students just like get it, right? Like when they are engaged in the topic and that they see the beauty that you're seeing, right? Like that's one thing. But also there's benefits to when students challenge you and they're like, I think this is dumb. um, because like in those times, like you're still, engaging with, a human being about questions that matter and things that are worth discussing. And even if they don't, I'm thinking of some students who really, really, really did not like reading Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And it became kind of a joke of the class where I am just singing his praises. And they're like, he's really difficult though. But, there's still that shared experience of learning where we get to discuss these ideas and, grow in our understanding of the world together. So, I think just talking with students and talking about students, or talking with students about things that I think are really cool and interesting, and also learning from students. So okay, it's really weird now that I'm teaching college. I'm teaching an English, English 104 to a bunch of STEM majors, and none of them, none of them are reading the Divine Comedy for fun. But they're also doing really interesting research papers that I'm learning so much from, and it's honestly, I think like it's a joy of teaching to be like, these kids are really smart, and I get to provide a space for them to explore ideas. Yeah, so I don't know, talking about stuff I love and just talking with students.
Yeah, those dialogues that you're describing are often the times in disagreement that you develop the skills that you hope will carry you through life. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
how to order your thoughts, how to ask good questions, how to marshal the evidence, how to exercise judgment. All essentially human factors.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and as a teacher, it's not my job to tell the students what to think, but it's the hope that they're learning how to think well, and that, they are on this journey toward the truth, and they're it's just my job to kind of be the facilitator of their learning how to think well.
Do you hope so? Think off into the future. You finish your dissertation and so forth and so on. Do you always hope to teach?
I do, yeah. Yeah. I don't know, I feel that I'm better suited toward teaching at the college level. That seems to be working better with my own kind of natural rhythms of wanting some time to have some time and space to read and research and write things, but then also being in the classroom with students. And so, yes, I would love to continue teaching. I hope that's at the college level. But I'm open to wherever I end up.
So I want to thank you again, Evyn, for your time. This has been a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And I was thinking maybe we could end this interview with part of the end of the story of Arthur. Something that happens at the end of his life. He's badly wounded. He's wounded by Mordred, right?
Yes.
Which isn't Mordred his son that he had with his sister, not knowing that she was his sister?
Yeah, depending on the story. So, in Mallory, it's his son. Sometimes it's his nephew in, I think, Geoffrey of Monmouth. But yeah, generally, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, another example of the strangeness of the lives of the people in these stories. But he's wounded by Mordred, is dying, and he asks one of his knights, Bedivere, to throw Excalibur back into the lake. Excalibur being his sword, which he gets early on in the stories from the Lady of the Lake. It's a hand reaching up out of the lake with the sword. And at the end of his life, he wants to throw the sword back so that it's lost beneath the waters. And in fact, Bedivere, thinking it's such a fine sword, 2 times comes back and tells Arthur that he's thrown it into the lake, and Arthur knows that he's lying, and he sends them back again until finally he actually does throw it back into the lake and comes back and tells Arthur. What do you make of the getting rid of the sword at the end of Arthur's life? A sword that was sort of the exemplar of his kingship.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's interesting in that Excalibur is a supernatural object, right? And kind of seems to embody the fact that King Arthur is in a lot of ways like a supernatural being. He's helped along by Merlin. He has this supernatural aid all throughout his entire narrative. So his vocation is very much, in a lot of ways, a very otherworldly one. And so Excalibur is interesting in that it is very much part of that reality, and it kind of feels like just an extension of who he is and what he represents, which is, a flourishing, well-ordered world, right? So once King Arthur leaves, then it makes sense that the sword is going to go back into the lake, right? It's going back to the enchanted location from which it came.
And is that kind of like the end of the supernatural, the requirement to take what we have learned and then return to the real?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, but then there's also the fact that Arthur is the once and future king, right? There's the idea that he's asleep somewhere and he will return, right? There's going to be this return of some sort of longed for redemption or some sort of future glory.
Right. Yeah, because he's supposed to be taken off to Avalon, where
Yes.
he'll be mystically healed and come back at some unknown date.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So you have at the one time the casting off of this kind of relic of the supernatural, the end of Arthur's, let's call it mortal life, for lack of a better term, but then this promise of return.
Yeah.
I mean, is that where we find ourselves? Stuck between the casting off and the hope of return?
Yeah. I think, in theological terms, we have the idea of like the already and the not yet, right? Like Christ has already arrived and redeemed the world and is in the process of redeeming the world. But we are also not yet fully complete, and we're still waiting for the new heavens and the new earth, right? So there's this weird thing of like we long for the future redemption, but also the redemption is here and Christ is with us, and the supernatural is still with us, right? So even as we're in the real, right, and yet we're surrounded by the supernatural, and yet we're also longing for the future glory of which we can't even speak.
Yeah. Even as you live in the fall and the loss of paradise, the reunification of that paradise is already real.
Yeah.
Evyn, I want to thank you again for helping us to see these stories in a new and a deeper light. And I hope that it causes us to go back and read them again.
Yeah, well, thank you for the chat. This has been lovely.
Thank you. At the end of my conversation with Evyn, I was thinking more about myths or legends, or whatever may be the most appropriate term. We mentioned several times about the whole body of authors and artists, one that is still growing, that has contributed to Arthurian legend over the millennia. Different interpretations, retellings, reimaginings, even repurposings. And I wondered, is that part of what makes a myth or a legend? That we, as humanity, have lived with a story and retold it from so many perspectives that it attains a level of universality and interpretive freedom, maybe even bolstered by a cultural familiarity that allows us touch points at different parts of our own personal growth. Is it that universality, not just in the sense of limitless potential for interpretation, but universal experience built into the story? Is that what makes it more than a story? Does it mean that it can tell us more? That's maybe a different question for another time. And finally, how does this relate to the casting off of the sword Excalibur at the end of the story, and Arthur going off to the mystical Isle of Avalon? Maybe the real Arthur was taken to be buried on Glastonbury Tor at a time when it was island-like, surrounded by marshes. Maybe with the encrusted layers that we're discussing, this became the mystical island from which he would return. But in any event, the end of Arthur's rule meant at the time that the power vacuum that he had filled was again open. Maybe that a respite of peace and flourishing was over. We mentioned at the end of our discussion the loss of paradise, how mystical order remains, but the world is marred by sin. To mystically expand on the concept of legend making, is it now our turn to contribute our verse, to lift a line from Whitman, and in our own way to convey the eternal truths in a world that is in wait? Maybe in paradox, I think also of the sword that barred the entrance to the garden in Genesis. That sword, too, has been cast down. Christ has opened the way. Do we then contribute our verse, contribute our song, draw from all these shared layers of universal experience, and point the way?